I'm very proud to be a representative of Harry Truman, one of the great leaders in our time. You know, Harry Truman left office with some of the lowest poll numbers in recorded history. He's consistently ranked as one of the leading, fifth or sixth most important president behind Washington, Lincoln, and the two Roosevelts. Now, that occasionally you will see some of these polls of historians and others who will put Eisenhower ahead of Truman. Now, in independence, we call that fake news. We do respect and appreciate the fact that we've got a couple of great leaders from the Midwest, and the part of the country I'm not necessarily from, but have very much enjoyed. Just one final thought on Truman before I jump into the topic. When I was first appointed, I was appointed by the Archivist of the United States, David Ferrier, and he appointed me to go out to Kansas City and to do this big renovation that we have underway that I'll reference in my remarks. We're trying to bring Truman's legacy into the 21st century and make him relevant to a new and younger audience. And so I was introduced to some members of the board, but also to the president's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, who lives in Chicago. He's the family representative to the library. And we were talking about Truman and how wise he was, and I talked about different quips that I thought Truman, I consider Truman the Will Rogers of the American presidency. He's got all this great wit and wisdom. And I said, just talking about that, and Clifton said to me, he said, my favorite saying that Grandpa ever had was never kick a fresh turd on a hot day. So that was my introduction to the Truman family. And I wasn't sure if I was the fresh turd or the guy with dirty boots, but I knew I was in for an interesting run. But anyway, I wanted to begin, and again, I'm here to speak specifically about an aspect of Truman's legacy that I hope is near and dear to this audience. It certainly has become very important to me because it represents more than just Truman's commitment to a certain community. It represents, I think, his sense of fair play and his sense of humanity and his sense of compassion. And I hope that comes out in some of what I have prepared for you tonight. I want to start, though, with a quote that later in his life, when Truman was retired, he used to go on walks all around Independence. And in fact, I've got to digress. I will get into my remarks, I promise. But there's a point that we have an oral history from a woman. She was a young woman, an immigrant, I believe, maybe from Germany. But she was a young woman. She had a baby in a little baby buggy, and she went on a walk every morning in Independence. And she walked with this old guy around the streets of Independence, just happened to meet up with him around the corner or whatever. And one day a friend of hers leans out the window and says, hey, what are you doing? And so she peels off from this old guy and she comes over and she said, what are you doing? She said, I just go for a walk everywhere. This kindest old man, he just lives around the corner. And she said, do you know who that is? And she said, no, just an old guy that lives around the corner. She said, that's the former president of the United States. And she couldn't believe it. And I thought, that says a lot about who Harry Truman was. That after he had been walking with this woman for however many weeks or however long it had been, she still didn't know that he was the former president. So Harry Truman grew up in Missouri. That was very important to him. But as he reflected back on his life, he said, when you grow up in a place like this, you just come to accept that certain things are the way they are. And he was talking specifically about race relations. His mother was a southerner, descended from a slaveholding family, and they were, when he got back from World War I, she asked him to take off his blue uniform before he came in the house. She apparently preferred a man in gray. And she would not sleep in the Lincoln bedroom when he was president, when she came to visit. She was an unreformed, unbowed, unrepentant Confederate. And so Truman grew up in that kind of environment. And he said, when I think back, I realize that you just come to accept that certain things are the way they are. And he quotes here, it was only when I was in the Army and went to Europe that I saw a fairer picture of the blacks in the U.S. As president, I did my best to change their status and help reduce discrimination. sometimes when I think about this subject, I regret that I didn't do more. Now, it may seem strange to begin a discussion of Truman and Israel by talking about civil rights, but I think there's a real strong connection here, because I think that Truman did not, a sense of fairness was something that he developed along the way. It was something he had in him long before he was president. So when he becomes president, it's a very natural thing for him to do some of the things he did, including some dramatic changes. We won't get off on the tangent of civil rights. That will be for another day, another time. But he did a great deal to advance equality among the races in America, to the point that Lyndon Johnson, when he was leaving office, called Harry and Bess on Christmas morning, 1968. And he said that his staff had given him a plaque of all of his major accomplishments, of Johnson's major accomplishments. And he said, you know, Bess, I looked down that plaque and I realized about half of those things started with Harry. And including some of the Great Society legislation, the civil rights legislation that he was so known for and deservedly so. So this is something that Truman comes with before he gets the presidency. And it starts, certainly his understanding of the importance of Israel is something he had from a much younger age, including his service in World War I, that we'll get to in a few minutes, but and the Balfour Declaration and things like that he was well aware of. But it was when he was a senator, and he spent about 10 years in the Senate. He went there in 1934 and served there until he was made vice president. But in 1943, he spoke at a rally in Chicago. And it was a rally to demand rescue of doomed Jews. And this was a clarion call that he issued, saying, we know what's going on. It's time to act. And he said, and I want to read you his words because I think they're very important. We must make sure that when final victory is achieved, all men throughout the world will live in peace, free from all oppression. Today, not tomorrow, we must do all that is humanly possible to provide a haven and place of safety for all those who can be grasped from the hands of the Nazi butchers. Free lands must be open to them. Their present oppressors must know that they will be held directly accountable for their bloody deeds. To do all of this, we must draw deeply on our tradition of aid to the oppressed and to our great national generosity. This is not a Jewish problem. It is an American problem. And we must and we will face it squarely and honorably. This is 1943, a junior senator from a little known Midwestern state. Power-wise, little known. So I want to jump back for just a second here and talk about what happens to this senator. How does he get where he gets? And just have a little review of this, because this all comes crashing down on Truman. He did not want to be vice president. Okay, it's interesting. I like to say that history is full of all kinds of examples of people being thrown out of office. In Harry Truman, we have a rare example of someone being thrown into office. In 1944, he loved the Senate. He had been in the Senate for 10 years. He had established a reputation for himself. He enjoyed the camaraderie of his fellow senators. But he everybody recognized, that FDR was sick. The Democrats didn't want Wallace because they knew they didn't want him to be president. And so Truman was kind of stuck. They really strong-armed him into doing this. And he didn't want it because he said history had not been kind to people who had come to the presidency through the back door. And that's how he saw it, coming in through the back door. So he hummed and hawed and did not really want to do it, but in the end, Roosevelt had to put pressure on him. So he becomes vice president, and he's on April 12th, 1945. He's gaveling the Senate, which again, he decides that it's okay to be vice president because the vice president's only constitutional duty is to preside over the Senate. He said, I can do that. Maybe that will be my contribution to the administration. So he does that. He's gaveling the Senate, finishing up his Jefferson Day address, which is going to be delivered the next day. And he's over at the end of that day in Sam Rayburn's office. Rayburn is from Texas. He's the Speaker of the House, good friend of Truman's. They're very close. And they're over at Rayburn's office having a little meeting they call the Board of Education, which was bourbon and branch water after work. And they're going through that, having a drink, talking it over, and he gets a call. He says, Mr. Vice President, come to the White House immediately. So he leaves the House side of the office, Sam Rayburn's office, runs all the way across the Capitol, to the Senate side, gets in a car, is driven to the White House, goes up to the second floor, is escorted there, and Eleanor Roosevelt meets him and says, Harry, the president is dead. And he said, ma'am, is there anything I can do for you? And she said, the question is, Harry, is there anything we can do for you? For you're the one in trouble now. And he knew exactly how much trouble he was in, not the kind of trouble he wanted. But just to get a sense of this trouble, within 48 hours, his advisors, his cabinet members, pulled him aside and said, Mr. President, there's something we need to share with you. It was the Manhattan Project. It was the bomb. He didn't know. He had only been vice president for 82 days, and he had only met privately with Roosevelt twice. Roosevelt, as you know, had gone to Yalta. Roosevelt was sick. Roosevelt had a different style. He had different things going on. He didn't know much or care much about Truman or bring him up to speed or whatever. So anyway, in some ways our obsession with Truman's decision regarding the bomb is obscuring the fact that he'd been working on the plight of Jews and other targeted Europeans even as a senator. And this is something he had been well aware of. And he continued to labor on that actively throughout his presidency. So as he becomes president, almost 2 years to the day that he delivers that Chicago Stadium speech about the doomed Jews, he now felt the fate of what he called the ancient people, meaning Jewish people, and of course every other people for that matter, rest directly on his shoulders. And everybody in the world was asking the question, can he swing the job? That's how they phrased it in 1945. Well, what kind of shoulders did he have? What could the world expect from a Midwestern farmer, a failed haberdasher, failed clothing store owner, a farmer who never even went to college? He's the last of our presidents who does not have a college degree. As one pundit put it, the simple fact is that Truman just isn't the type of strongman to whom folks turn in the time of national danger. The idea of Truman as a man on horseback is just funny. Now, I will fully concede to you that George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan all looked better on a horse than did Harry Truman. But I would further submit to you that the measure of leadership is far greater than one's equestrian prowess. With or without a horse, the man who would become Give 'em Hell Harry inherited a world that was careening toward the end of what had been the most destructive and cataclysmic event in all of human history. 80 million people. You think about the globe. Think about what's going on with World War II. And, but of course, as you all know, the end of the war did not mean the end of the suffering, dislocation, and devastation that the war had brought about. In many ways, this is just the beginning of what Truman's legacy ultimately would be. You know, a historian recently wrote that never has so much history been shoehorned into so little time when you talk about those first 4 months of Truman's presidency. I mean, incredible amount. I mean, he gets on-the-job training from April of 45 when he becomes president. By August, the bombs have been dropped and the war is over. That's a pretty amazing 4 months. I mean, the momentum is there. I'm not saying Truman did all that. I'm just saying that that's what you call on-the-job training. That's what you call hit the ground running in your new job. But it sets up a series of opportunities, really, for Truman in Europe and elsewhere at the end of the war. That the things that we really know about Truman, that I think he really deserves a lot of credit for, are things that grow out of that circumstance as the war ends. The Truman Doctrine, for example. The idea that we will stand with anyone who is facing oppressors. I mean, that idea that we're going, this notion of the American century, if you will, or America filling that role around the world. That grows out of the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan, unprecedented levels of foreign aid, rebuilding the world, including the combatant nations that you've been up against. Someone once asked Harry Truman, what do you do with a vanquished foe? And he said, you welcome them back into the family of nations. He understood full well, as a combat veteran of World War I himself, that you cannot keep a people down. And by trying to keep Germany down after World War I, we end up with Hitler in World War II. And he said, we have, and to this day, Germany and Japan are two of our closest allies because of Truman's attitude toward them. Think of the Berlin airlift. Think of the incredible logistical effort that was. Ultimately, the founding of NATO. When I have VIP visitors come all the time to the Truman Library, and I always think of the ambassador from Korea who came, and I was sharing this particular room in our exhibit that covers these topics I've just mentioned, the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, etc. And he said, Harry Truman and Winston Churchill put in place the architecture, the structure, that has given the world more peace and more prosperity for more people than at any other comparable time in the history of the world. And he wasn't just talking about America or Western Europe. He was talking about, he's the ambassador from Korea, he was talking about peoples everywhere have enjoyed more peace and more prosperity because of what Truman and others helped to put in place at that time. And it's an interesting time, those of us who work in what we call the Truman business, it's an interesting time to be in the Truman business because that structure, that scaffolding, is being questioned in ways that it never has been before. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I didn't come here to make a political speech, I'll leave that to you to decide. But as a historian, I can say I hope it is being dismantled with the same thoughtful, considerate effort with which it was put together. Truman assembled one of the great foreign policy teams of all time. George Marshall, April Harriman, Kennan. These guys were incredible. There's never been a group like that. And what they put together and how they did that, I think is incredible. So, in addition to all of that Truman is trying to confront, back to our subject matter here a little bit more directly, he faces the problem of what to do with all of these people who are being liberated from the camps in Europe. And the concentration camps become, displaced persons. All these displaced people, what do we do with them? They don't have, in some cases, they don't have a home to go back to, don't have a country to go back to. Where can you make sure that there's safety and peace for these people? And I want to pick up a thread just because I think this is interesting, and this is just further building on the fact that Annie missed seeing the Eisenhower Library, which was really clearly the central mistake of his life. We're hopeful that you'll remedy that in a future family trip. But on the same day that FDR died and that Truman became president, General Eisenhower was getting his first glimpses of what the end of the war would look like. On April 12th, he was touring a concentration camp. A former concentration camp, a liberated camp. And he wrote to General George Marshall. Marshall, of course, was the one who made Eisenhower. And he wrote this. And we have moving footage, video footage of Ike touring this camp on April 12th. It's really a unique moment where you know exactly what three presidents were doing, within hours of one another on that day. He said to General Marshall, the most interesting, although horrible, sight that I encountered during the trip was a visit to a German internment camp near Gotha. The things I saw beggar description. While I was touring the camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates, and by one ruse or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room where they piled up 20 to 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. said he would get sick if he did go. I made the very deliberate visit in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. To his everlasting credit, Ike forced the media, including the German media, reporters, photographers, and I can't say videographers in those days, but filmers, film crews, to follow him into that camp and to record those pictures. And simply so he could say that this can't be rationalized away, this can't be explained away as some sort of hoax or some sort of propaganda. This was very real. And of course, Truman is getting these reports. I mean, he's understanding the full gravity of this. He understands what's going on. And of course, these camps are being liberated. It had begun prior to Truman becoming president, but it's really the spring of '45 when these camps start to be liberated. And the real news that, like what Ike is reporting, is coming out. And so it's interesting that as the wartime atrocities and genocide came to an end, a catastrophic humanitarian crisis was just beginning. What they encountered, these liberators, the living, the dead, the dying, each of whom posed, each of these classes, categories, posed its own dilemmas. Liberation brought on a need for a relief effort that they had grossly misunderestimated. The logistics were complicated. The medical crisis caught liberators wholly unprepared. They gave the captives freedom, but in some cases they gave them the wrong food. There's all kinds of just tragic stories about the rich rations that hit these systems that had been, taken to the brink of starvation. It killed them. They couldn't handle it. Disease turned out to be as deadly as the gas chambers. Doctors couldn't reverse conditions fast enough, and the liberators had such limited resources for the scale of suffering they encountered. Prisoners came to these places with different languages, different religious backgrounds. They weren't all Jewish. I mean, these people didn't even sometimes be able to communicate with one another in the camps because they didn't speak the same languages. And PTSD was something that not just prisoners suffered from, but some of the liberators. You hear stories from some of the people who entered those camps, and they were never the same again. So, because they had underestimated the scale of the problem, this liberation effort, the death rates remained stubbornly high. And it was a very confusing time for liberators and liberated alike. Well, these kinds of reports, this kind of understanding that Truman had known about and spoken about before, but now was suddenly becoming clear, it really bothered him. I mean, it was something that he felt that needed to be addressed. And he said, the grave dislocation of populations in Europe resulting from the war has produced human suffering that the people of the United States cannot and must not ignore. And he goes on, he has a report, the Harrison report, I'm sure you're aware of that, where the report comes back and says, basically, these people are no better off now than they were under the Nazis. I mean, we've become the caretakers of the camp, but we've just changed out the SS for our own military guard. And Truman said, one is led to wonder whether the German people, seeing this, are not supposing that we are following, or at least condoning, the Nazi policy. It wasn't happening fast enough for him. It wasn't happening. And he kind of got on Ike about it, saying, get the program here, bud. I mean, make this happen. And so he offers some suggestions to Eisenhower, which Eisenhower didn't necessarily fully appreciate, but of course he understood the commander-in-chief and that role, so he was probably not as direct as he might have been years later and in another setting. But this question of the poor and the oppressed and the people who had been through what they had been through in Europe was something that became a great motivator for Truman. There was a point where he said, he talked about the people needing to escape the mad genocide of Hitler's Germany. And in his memoirs, he wrote that their fate was a matter of deep personal concern to me. I have always been disturbed by the tragedy of people who have been made victims of intolerance and fanaticism because of their race, color, or religion. These things should not be possible in a civilized society. For Harry Truman, the very definition, the very foundation, the very continuance of civilization was based on how we as a people, we as a nation, the United States, would react to this crisis. So this is what he encounters in 1945, and he starts working on these things moving forward. And then he gets to a big year, which is 1948. And I hope it's become clear that this is something Truman was very concerned about long before 1948. Even as a senator, the idea of a national Jewish home was something that he had warmed to, and he liked the idea. And as you know, he had to fight the British and others on this subject. They were not as in favor of this, but Truman said, we've got to do something. And of course, you know the story of the partition plan and all of that. But what's interesting about it to me is that for Truman, given who he was, this moment and this decision to recognize Israel lies at this kind of intersection of ancient history, of modern history, and recent events. It all came together for him and pointed to this one moment. Truman was a very avid reader his whole life. He couldn't afford to go to college, so he never had a college degree. But I'm convinced he knew more than most professors of the day because he read everything. And he read thoroughly. I mean, he once said, people who are reading are preparing for leadership. Not all readers are leaders, but all leaders must be readers. You know, so that was a very important to him, and he lived that. He read even when the television era came in. He had a TV tucked away in the corner. He never looked at it. He just had a pile of books by his chair. But he read the Bible, and he read other antiquarian texts, and knew them as well as anyone in public life. And so the context of a passage like the 137th Psalm, for example, would not have been lost on Truman. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. The notion of the gathering of scattered Israel was not an allegory or a mythological tale. It was, for Harry Truman, literal history. And the history that he had experienced himself, I mentioned the World War I era, the Balfour Declaration, which had promised the Jewish people a homeland. And it was a promise that Harry Truman said, I felt, should be honored. We had promised that we would do this, and it's time to do this. And of course, there's also the great story that you may be aware of, his lifelong friend, Eddie Jacobson. He was a Jewish friend from Kansas City. They had run the commissary together on the post. They sort of had some experience in World War I together, and then they ended up opening the haberdashery, the clothing store in Kansas City at a bad economic time. That they ended up going out of business, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, because he went on to do other things. But it was Jacobson who ultimately convinced Truman to have a meeting with Chaim Weizmann around this question of recognizing Israel. And by the way, Truman initially pronounced his name Chan. But that was a very crucial meeting, and it may not have happened had Eddie Jacobson not been in the mix, had his friend not come in and said, I need to do this. And you see the quote out here in our little pop-up exhibit. That's the great one where he says, okay, you bald-headed son of a bitch, I'll talk to him. It's the real friendly terms that we had. But it was a friendship. But despite all of that, you would think, well, he's got these personal connections, he's got this kind of religious feeling about it, he's got this deep sense of history, and he sees all this coming together. You think, well, it's a no-brainer for Truman, right? Why wouldn't he recognize Israel? Of course he would. Well, it wasn't quite that simple. From a logical perspective, maybe so. But the question as that question came to a head of whether to extend recognition to Israel, I would suggest to you that forces swirled in and around Harry Truman in ways that forces have rarely swirled around a presidential decision. The persistence of what he called the problem of Palestine set Truman at odds, not only with some close U.S. allies like the British, but it also caused him to be undermined by his own State Department. They really, these days things would be different, I suppose, but it pitted his closest advisors and closest friends against one another, including threatened to jeopardize his upcoming campaign. George Marshall, for example. George Marshall was a hero to Truman. I mean, he revered Marshall. I mean, the reason the Marshall Plan is called the Marshall Plan and not the Truman Plan is because Truman had that much respect for Marshall. And so, think about this. It's an election year. It's May, 71 years ago, May of 1948. Now, 1948, in the fall of 1948, there's going to be a presidential election. Now, presidential elections only lasted 2.5 months in those days, not 2.5 years like they do now. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter was, Truman was going to be facing the electorate, and soon. So, in May of 1948, he extends this recognition to Israel. Later in July of that same summer, July 48, he desegregates the armed forces and the federal workforce. So blacks and whites are going to serve together in the military, going to serve side by side in government service. Now, again, then he kicks off the whistle stop campaign. He goes around the country on the train, and that's where the Give him Hell Harry comes from, by the way. Everybody shouts out, "Give him hell, Harry." He said, "I never gave him hell, I just told him the truth. He thought it was hell." But nevertheless, I hear this argument all the time. People say, well, Truman, surely he needed the votes. He's pandering to get Jewish votes. He's pandering to get African American votes. And clearly, those were important constituencies. Those were important groups. And so it makes sense that those decisions would have been popular among those constituencies. But I would suggest to you that 1948 was not exactly the zenith of inclusion and a sense of fair play in America. And it seems to me that he stood just as good a chance of alienating very large swaths of the population with both of those decisions. And that's what I think, that's what makes this important to me. Because it's more than his friendship with Eddie Jacobson or his feelings about General Marshall. It's more than a personal faith or a sense of history that he had. It's even more than the political moment that he's in. And facing one of the really tough electoral moments in American history. He ended up walking away with the election, by the way, but nevertheless. More than that, more than all of those things together, I think brought Truman that decision to recognize Israel. What stands out to me again and again about Harry Truman and the decisions that he made is the simple fact that he not only consistently did what he believed was the right thing, but he did it for the right reason. And I think both of those elements are important. A phrase that he used over and over again when he addressed this topic was to relieve human suffering. That mattered to Truman. It mattered to him about the Jewish suffering and the DP camps and all that in the same way that Isaac Woodard getting pulled off a bus and beaten so severely in the South, an African-American soldier returning from having fought for his country, pulled off a bus in uniform in the South and beaten to the point that he lost his sight. And Truman said, enough. We're not doing this anymore. And again, it was Strom Thurmond, who was governor of South Carolina, who took the Dixiecrats, the racist wing of the Democratic Party, and ran against Truman in this election. And And when Truman started talking, as he did, he gave several speeches about civil rights and whatnot. And somebody said to Strom Thurmond, "What's the big deal? FDR talked about this stuff all the time. You know, yeah, equality for you know, just let it go." And he said, "No, but Truman means it." And he knew that he did. And so Thurmond went his way and ended up taking 30 electoral votes away from Truman. And there was a governor from a little-known state, Governor Dewey, is that? Representing the Republican Party. Not a particularly great campaigner, as I understand it, though I'm eager to learn more about him on this trip, as a matter of fact. But in any event, Truman ended up winning 303 electoral votes in that contest, which was quite a victory, given that 30 of those votes had gone to Strom Thurmond in the South, and that we didn't have Alaska and Hawaii at the time, so he didn't need even 270. You know, so it was a substantial victory all the same anyway. And I think it's kind of a reward for him for having done the right thing. He was always concerned about how people were being treated. And again, his policy, he later said that his policy in Palestine was not an Arab policy or a Jewish policy. It was, he said, an American policy because it was based on the desire to see promises kept and human misery relieved. And that is an interesting definition of what makes something an American policy. When Truman extended recognition to Israel just minutes after the new Jewish state was declared, reactions varied from elation to devastation. Truman never wavered. That's the great thing about Harry Truman. He made all these tough decisions, and he never lost any sleep over it. He never went back and said, "I don't know, should we have done this, should we have done that, I'm just not sure." Once he made a decision, it was in the books, and he moved on to the next decision. That's what leaders do. They absorb the anxiety of people around them, and they project confidence and a calm, and Truman did that unfailingly. "I had faith in Israel even before it was established," he once said. "I knew it was based on the love of freedom, which has been the guiding star of the Jewish people since the days of Moses. I believe it has a glorious future before it, not just as a sovereign nation, but as an embodiment of the great ideals of our civilization." Years later, Truman grew visibly emotional when Rabbi Isaac Herzog told him, "God put you in your mother's womb so you would be an instrument to bring the rebirth of Israel after 2,000 years. And the great David Ben-Gurion once said that of Truman, that as a foreigner, I could not judge what would be his place in American history, but his helpfulness to us, his constant sympathy with our aims in Israel, his courageous decision to recognize our state so quickly, and his steadfast support since then, has given him an immortal place in Jewish history. If I could be so bold as to add to Ben-Gurion, I would say that Harry Truman has garnered an immortal place in the history of the world. And I return to Lyndon Johnson, who said it best, "The American people voted for and loved Harry Truman, not because he gave them hell, but because he gave them hope." And it was, I think, it is this effort to extend Truman's sense of hope and optimism to a whole new generation. I mentioned that we are undertaking a major renovation, redevelopment of our Truman Library, and I hope you'll all come and pay us a visit at some point. I promise you a VIP tour, whatever you want, take you through. But as I mentioned, it's a great time to be in the Truman business because leadership and character and decision-making prowess have never been more needed and never been more appreciated than they are right now. And you can look on either side of the aisle and you look in vain for Truman's equal. There is no one who, and the great thing about being in the Truman business is you can't offend everybody, anybody. Right-wing Republicans love him, left-wing Democrats love him, everybody in the middle loves him. I mean, everybody yearns for someone who makes decisions based on a moral core, a moral center. So as we do this, as we go through this effort, we're working to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Truman becoming president, which was April of 1945. Or as my friend, the director of the FDR Library here in New York says, you're commemorating FDR's death. It just happens to coincide with the president. It's nothing personal. But likely sometime, we're going to close probably in about 6 weeks and close our exhibits and just got the whole thing adding on to the building. It's a major multi-million-dollar renovation. And when we come back, we will have a very robust treatment through our exhibits, interactive media, and film, and especially one of the guiding principles here, one of the reasons we undertook this big renovation. I mentioned bringing Truman into the 21st century. There are several aspects of Truman's legacy that are currently underrepresented in our current offering. And the scholarship is caught up, but we haven't been there. So, for example, his service in World War I, where he learned he could lead, hugely important to Truman. The Korean War, very important to his term in office. Civil rights, something we can say a whole lot more about. The recognition of Israel. We're going to have, instead of just a couple of cases like we have now about the birth of Israel, we're going to have a room that you walk into that's got a beautiful media piece, a screen that has, it sort of approximates the Star of David. It's got some shapes in it that in the middle, the decision will play out, but on one side you have all of the people who are telling Truman not to recognize Israel. And on the other side you have all the people who are telling him you should recognize Israel. And then the decision plays out in the middle. It's a very powerful way, I think, of helping especially younger people to understand how this story works and how it unfolded. And I say to you, without batting an eye and with complete seriousness, we believe that there is no better place in the United States to tell the story of the founding of Israel than at the Truman Library. No one owns that story in this country. You will see it represented, at least represented properly and well. And we plan to do it justice. We cannot and we do not assume that the rising generation will somehow absorb this important narrative through osmosis. Thank you. To be learned, it must be taught. And we are an educational institution, and that's what we are interested in doing. And I know in speaking to Rob earlier that you are very much focused on outreach as part of your mission here. And I think that's so important. I mean, it's so important to get the story out there. I mean, they're just not getting it. I mean, no. If we don't tell them, they won't know. But so we realize that the future of Truman's legacy rests on our collective shoulders, much as the fate of an infant nation once rested on his. And think about this. When the fate of an entire people was at stake, Truman not only recognized their plight, he recognized them. He recognized more than a problem, he recognized a solution. And it was, to be sure, a solution born not merely of diplomacy, but of humanity. So I'd like to end this by building on that metaphor and telling you that the tables have now turned. And it is Harry Truman who needs to be recognized. He needs to be recognized for doing the right thing for the right reasons. He merits recognition because he always returned to his core values when facing a complex decision. So for the character and the principles and the leadership he brought to the highest office in the land, he deserves to be recognized. And for those of us who work in and support the Truman business, it is now our responsibility and indeed our great privilege to see that he is. Thanks for having me.